Hello everybody, Comrade Xander here. Today we're going to be talking about the Soviet Union and actually existing socialism. For some reason, most of the mainstream left wing denies that the Soviet Union and existing socialism wasn't actually socialist. You hear them all the time. They repeat the same bullshit like it's clockwork, almost like none of them have had an original thought in their lives.
Any respected historian and theorist recognizes that the Soviet Union was actually state capitalism in the extreme. It never achieved any level of theoretical socialism, and certainly not communism. And if you look at the writings of Vladimir Lenin, he admits to this fact.
What ideology? The ideology of totalitarianism? Yeah, it's deeply flawed. I mean, they were the initial modern totalitarians. It's not anything to do with socialism. They destroyed socialism within weeks. You know, they didn't wait. By 1918, it was finished. And they knew it, you know, like it's not a secret. They knew it. I mean, in fact, Lenin, as soon as he sort of got grips of things after, he said, he moved to what he called state capitalism.
But for me, coming out of the Marxian tradition, which I learned from and which I have found very useful in this way, there is another stage to human development that hasn't been accomplished, neither in Russia nor in China. And that is the transformation of the workplace.
In this video, I want to outline how the Bolshevik Revolution failed because the institutions of workers' control were undermined and dismantled, and how the state undertook the role of the private despot.
So when you create a totalitarian dictatorship of the proletariat, by which you are specifically referring to as the vanguard party, the elite group of Marxist-Leninists that were able to convince the rest of the population to vote their party in, or to basically raise their party up, when you're talking about that, you're talking about a system that inherently breeds not communism, but state capitalism.
Comrades, in modern Western culture, we often call the Soviet Union socialist or communist without looking at the reality of the situation. The fact is, the Soviet Union never made the transition to socialism, and instead had a state capitalist economy.
Okay, so I think I've subjected you guys to enough cringe. Essentially, what all these left-wingers have in common is that they deny the existence of historical socialism. None of them have any firm grasp of the history of the USSR or understand what the theory of Leninism is about. Instead, they fall hook, line, and sinker for bourgeois propaganda, don't do any investigation for themselves, and to distance themselves from the alleged failures of historical socialism, they claim that it was never real socialism in the first place, mainly in an attempt to acquit themselves while at the same time falling prey to a massive no true Scotsman fallacy. Anyways, it's time for me to prove that the Soviet Union was most definitely socialist. When the impotent left tries to argue that Russia was state capitalist, they often cite two arguments. Number one, Vladimir Lenin himself said the system was state capitalist, and two, there was extraction of surplus value. Both of these things are true. However, allow me to start with the first point. Lenin did indeed call the system state capitalist. However, this was supposed to be a transitionary phase, a part of the new economic policy. You see, Russia had just come out of a brutal civil war, and at the time was, for all intents and purposes, still a semi-feudal nation. The productive forces simply were not built up enough for them to just instantly go to socialism. They tried that and it didn't work. So Lenin allowed for a degree of private ownership for a time, much of which was owned and controlled by the state. It's important to note that in the new Soviet government, there was no capitalist representation whatsoever, which means that for all intents and purposes, it was a worker-controlled government. Only workers could run, only workers could be in charge. Compare that to the United States, where our political cabinet and public servants are like all wealthy capitalists. But anyways, the new economic policy went on from 1921 to 1928. This was the state capitalist phase. However, this would change during the Stalin administration. Joseph Stalin came to power in 1924, outmaneuvering his political rivals, and by 1928, he abolished private property, collectivized the farmlands, and would usher in the first five-year plan. At this point, once there is no longer private property, when the economy is now a full-fledged command economy, and there is no longer a market, you can no longer call it capitalist in any meaningful sense of the word. But what about surplus value extraction? The workers didn't get paid the full value of their labor, so some of it went to the state. And this is true. However, nowhere in the writing of Marx did he say there wouldn't be surplus value extraction under socialism. Sure, the workers got back more than what they would under capitalism, but you still need some degree of value extraction to finance the roads, schools, hospitals, farms, research facilities, factories, army, and all the other things that are necessary to keep society functioning. It's silly to think that you can just give people 100% back everything that they work for. I agree that workers should own the fruits of their labor, and by extension they should receive the benefits of all of the collectivized amenities afforded to them, and this is exactly what they got. Virtually everything was subsidized in Russia, even non-essential things like the movies. Workers enjoyed consistent increases in the standard of living year by year, and even during the revisionist era when market reforms were implemented, the economy never fell into crisis, and they saw consistent growth up until the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a tutorial on how workers' control worked in Russia. But first, I'm going to define what a Soviet is, since most of you probably don't even know. A Soviet is a workers' council. Workers organized into these councils where they would democratically make decisions on policies and projects pertaining to their own workplace on a local scale. However, since they lived in a massive, expansive landscape such as Russia, they needed some centralized governing body to handle affairs on a large scale. This is when they would elect representatives to the regional Soviet, whom would make decisions on a regional scale. These Soviets would then elect national Soviets to make decisions on an even larger national scale. Finally, the national Soviets would elect members to the Supreme Soviet, who would end up being the most powerful individuals in the country, making decisions governing, well, the whole country. Sounds pretty hierarchical, right? And that is true. However, it's important to note that all these elected representatives are workers. None of them are wealthy capitalists. In Soviet Russia, there was no capitalist representation of the sort. Of course, things would change during the revisionist era, when Khrushchev would come to power and fuck everything up. But that's besides the point. Long story short, this is workers' control. Once again, the economy operated according to a plan, and the only representation there was in parliament was representation of the workers. You can have your grievances with how the system worked, you can have your grievances with the way it's structured, the way it functions, and you can even propose alternatives. However, you cannot say that this wasn't socialist. You cannot argue that this was state capitalist, because it clearly was not. If there's one unreasonable criticism that I think has been made of the Soviet Union and existing socialism over and over again, it's that the party had too much control. It's that these societies were too rigidly structured, and that workers should have been given direct control over everything. This is, of course, an absurdity. Nobody wants to vote on every single conceivable referendum and decision that is to be made in the economy. The level of direct democracy that is advocated by anarchists would have bogged the system down so much that decisions would take forever to finally be made. This is why we elect bureaucrats. Nobody wants to make every single tiny conceivable decision on their own. And in the case of the Soviet Union, there was very much necessity for a strong central body, considering most of the population were at the time illiterate peasants. And by extension, you need a highly educated vanguard to lead them onto the right path. In a revolutionary situation such as this one, when the government is constantly being attacked and undermined from within and without, the necessity for a strong central body is even more obvious. In 1918, Russia was invaded by 14 different imperialist powers with the intent of crushing the Bolsheviks. In a situation like this, everybody needs to be united. You can't have a section of the population taking over factories so they can produce their own shit and sell it for their own personal gain, when people are out there working themselves to the bone, fighting tooth and nail, and dying to secure the revolution. This is why the anarchists were ultimately betrayed, because they themselves betrayed the revolution. In a revolutionary situation, the people absolutely need to be united and ready to fend off the inevitable attacks from inside the gates and from outside at the same time. Whether you like it or not, when the revolution comes, you better be ready to work harder than you've ever worked in your life to secure it and make sure that the revolution succeeds. This means that we all need to work together. There must be structure, there must be order, there must be discipline, whether you like it or not. And mind you, the revolution won't happen here in the West the same way it happened in Russia. They had a completely different set of material circumstances that they had to work with. Our material conditions are different, so by extension our revolution will not look the same. Also, there's no reason why we can't look to the Soviets and adapt and assimilate what they did right while rejecting and discarding what they did wrong. That's how science works, after all. Final thoughts. When it comes to the impotent left and their denial of historical socialism and their fetishization of imaginary socialism, I think Parenti said it best.
A real socialism, it's argued, would be controlled by the workers themselves through direct participation instead of being run by Leninists, Stalinists, Castroites, or other ill-willed, evil leaders and bureaucrats who betray revolutions. We hear. Well, unfortunately, this pure socialism view is profoundly ahistorical and non-falsifiable. By that I mean it remains untestable against the actualities of history. It compares an ideal against an imperfect reality, and sure enough, reality comes off a poor second. The pure socialist ideological anticipations remain untainted by existing practice. They don't explain how a complex revolutionary society could be built and secured, how priorities could be set, how survival could be achieved by just having the workers own and control everything. How do you expropriate enough surplus value to build an army to defend yourself against the invasion that comes? It's no surprise that the pure socialists support every revolution except the ones that succeed.
This is seriously their position. I kid you not. And it's every bit as unrealistic and utopian and childish as it sounds. Well, that's not real socialism. That's not real socialism either. The only true socialism that exists is the idealized fantasy in my head where everything works out just fine. We all drink hot cocoa, throw on a little blanket, get around a Christmas tree, hold hands, sing Kumbaya, my lord. Nobody has to fight. There's no bloodshed or conflict or discipline or structure or theory or mistakes that are made. So now I can absolve myself from having to defend actually existing socialism, since I stand above the fray and I'm enlightened, and if I were in those revolutionary situations, I would have done things different and ushered in the proper socialist utopia. Grow the hell up, people. Stop being utopians and come back to reality for a moment. This video is supposed to be informative. I'm not trying to talk shit or condescend to anyone. I'm trying to steal you people with the facts so that rather than capitulating and falling prey to a blatant no true Scotsman fallacy, you can actually stand up and defend the legacy of socialism. The legacy that people have fought and literally died for so that we could live in a more sustainable, egalitarian society where people can take destiny into their own hands. But anyways, that's all I have to say for now.